If you Google the most incredible story of all time, this story that I'm going to tell you today pops up all over the internet. And after reading through it, I can totally understand why. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer the like button a bag of Rebels, but only leave them the coffee-flavored kind. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. The United States formally entered World War II on December 8, 1941, after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. At the time, Joseph Byerly was a senior at his high school in Muskegon, Michigan, and he had a scholarship to attend Notre Dame University the next year. But after his graduation in 1942, he decided he didn't want to go to college so long as other kids his age were going off to fight the war. And so he enlisted in the Army, and he immediately volunteered for one of the most dangerous units, the parachute infantry. Joseph completed a brutal, accelerated training regimen that included exhausting PT in blistering heat, extended forced marches, grueling full kit runs up mountains, as well as both American and British jump schools. By 1943, Joseph was fully trained and stationed in England and was eager to put his training to the test. But the Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied France, also known as D-Day, was still a few months away. But Joseph didn't want to wait that long, so he volunteered for an incredibly dangerous mission that the OSS was recruiting paratroopers for. The OSS was the predecessor to the CIA. Basically, volunteers would parachute in the middle of the night into Nazi-occupied France with a backpack full of gold. Once they hit the ground, they'd meet up with the French resistance and give the gold to them, and then the resistance would do their best to protect these volunteer paratroopers and hopefully give them a ride back out to England. But by no means was it a guarantee, because many of these volunteers were killed in the process. This was some hardcore, deep cover spy work that the OSS would tell their volunteers, if you get caught on this mission, you're gonna get tortured and you're gonna get executed. Joseph would successfully complete this insane mission, and then he liked it so much, he did it again. Shortly after his second successful OSS mission, word came down that D-Day was set to take place on June 6th. Joseph's unit was told they were going to be parachuted into France the night before in order to destroy bridges, cut power supply lines, and generally soften up defenses before the main invasion happened just a couple of hours later at Utah Beach. So in the dead of night on June 5th, Joseph and his unit were flying over France when they were struck by enemy fire. And so as their plane is literally falling to the ground, Joseph leaps out the door when he's only 400 feet off the ground, and he manages to survive the jump, his parachute inflated just in time, but he landed on top of a church where a Nazi sniper was up in the steeple taking shots at all of the other paratroopers. And when the sniper saw Joseph on the roof, he began taking shots at him, and Joseph managed to dodge the rounds before slipping off the roof and running out of sight. Once on the ground, he slammed a mag into his M1 carbine and then began a one-man mission so incredible that there is a plaque inside of the church he landed on that looks like this. Completely alone, with no idea where the rest of his unit was, Joseph took off running from the church and once again had to dodge more sniper fire, and he eventually made it to the town's power substation, which he blew up with thermite. So he cut the power to the town, and from there he went building to building to building, killing every Nazi he came across, including an entire squad of Nazi infantry that he ambushed with grenades. At some point, Joseph made his way over to one of the bridges leading into this town that if he blew up, it would prevent Nazis from sending reinforcements to Utah Beach. But as he crawled through one of the hedgerows, he fell headfirst into a Nazi machine gun nest, and when he turned around, there were a bunch of machine guns pointed at his face, and so he surrendered. Joseph was marched deeper into France to a POW holding area, and as soon as he got there, explosions ripped out all around him. It wasn't clear if it was German artillery or American aircraft, but whatever it was killing both Germans and American POWs. Joseph took shrapnel to the leg and was blown into a ditch, and despite being in excruciating pain, he took this as an opportunity to escape. And so he got up and ran away as best as he could with his injury, and for 12 hours he remained uncaught behind enemy lines before he was ultimately caught again. This time they put Joseph in the back of a covered locked truck to keep him from escaping, and they decided they would send him to St. Lo and decide what to do with him there. But on their transit to St. Lo, an Allied aircraft strafed the vehicle that Joseph was in, and Joseph survived the attack and was able to leap out of one of the holes in the side of the truck from this attack, and he attempted to escape, but once again he was caught. The Nazis finally got Joseph to St. Lo, and as soon as they got there, the Americans launched an all-night bombing campaign on the city, but once again, Joseph narrowly survives. A recurring theme of Joseph's story is that he is repeatedly almost killed by his own teammates. For the next few days, Joseph was interrogated 20 to 24 hours a day, but he didn't give them any information, and he repeatedly called them sons of bitches until they got so fed up with him, they just beat him to a pulp, and he was knocked unconscious and kept in the hospital for several days. For the next 3 months, Joseph was starved, beaten, interrogated some more, and moved to multiple POW camps. He'd be forced to do back-breaking labor all day. At night, he would survive Allied bombing runs, and he would constantly weather hunger, disease, and exhaustion. At one point, he was locked inside of this boxcar with 50 other guys. He could barely move inside of it, and once again, it was strafed by Allied planes, and he was one of the very few people to survive that. In September of 1944, Joseph was moved to a Russian POW camp in Poland that held about 12,000 Russian men and women POWs. And as soon as he got there, he immediately began planning his escape. 2 months later, on a freezing night in November, Joseph, along with 3 other American POWs, managed to cut the barbed wire and snuck out of the camp and began making their escape south. They snuck into a railway station and hopped on a train car they believed was headed for Poland. Their plan was to meet up with the Soviet Red Army as it pushed through the region. But unfortunately, they got on the wrong train and they wound up in Berlin, the capital of Nazi Germany. One thing you don't hear much about when it comes to World War II is there was actually a large number of Germans that hated Hitler and totally disagreed with the Nazis. And so they organized a German underground resistance that was designed to help the Allies during the war. And so when Joseph and the other 3 American POWs arrived in Berlin, still wearing their POW uniforms, a member of the German resistance saw them and immediately grabbed them and brought them into hiding. But after only a week, the infamous Nazi secret police, aka the Gestapo, discovered them and arrested them. Over the next 10 days, Joseph and the other American POWs got to see firsthand just how awful the Gestapo really were. They were constantly interrogated while they were beaten, kicked, walked on, strung up by their arms backwards. They were hit with whips, clubs, and rifle butts until they drifted into unconsciousness. And then as soon as they started to come to, it would start all over again. After those 10 days, the Gestapo turned Joseph and the other 3 American POWs over to the German army, who put them in the brutal prison camp called the Stalag Luft III. Upon arrival, Joseph was immediately sentenced to 30 days inside of a 4 by 5 foot pine box that was too small to stand up or lay down in. Fortunately for him, he only had to endure 7 days because a Red Cross operative from Geneva intervened on his behalf. It would take months for Joseph to get his strength back after being inside of this box, but as soon as he did, he began plotting his next escape. One night, Joseph, along with his 3 American POW buddies, managed to break through a prison wall and made a mad dash for freedom, but the Nazi prison guards saw it and opened fire on them. All 3 of Joseph's friends were killed as they ran, but Joseph got away, only to hear the faint barking of the German shepherds the Nazis had sent to hunt him down. So in the freezing cold of Poland in January, Joseph leapt headfirst into a partially frozen river and swam over 2 miles down it before getting out and running blindly into the woods. Somehow, miraculously, he managed to reach Soviet lines before he froze to death. And there, he spoke with battalion commander Alexandra Samosenko, a woman who holds the distinction of being the only female tank commander in all of World War II. Even though Joseph spoke very little Russian, he convinced her to let him join her unit. And so she gave him a gun and some ammunition, and she told him what their next objective was. They were going to liberate the same POW camp he had just escaped from. And so Joseph, alongside the Soviet Red Army that he now fought for, turn around and go smash this POW camp. And after the dust had settled, Joseph raided the main camp office and stole his defiant official POW photo that the Germans had taken of him on the first day he got captured. Joseph continued to fight alongside the Soviets across the Eastern Front for a couple of months, but when a German dive bomber blew up the tank that Joseph was riding on, he was evacuated to a Russian field hospital. There, he received a visit from Georgy Zhukov, the most important Soviet military commander in World War II, who was intrigued by the only non-Soviet in the hospital. He sat with Joseph and learned his story through an interpreter, and then afterwards he provided Joseph with official paperwork that would allow him to rejoin American forces. And so in February of 1945, Joseph was sent to the US Embassy in Moscow, but unfortunately, when he finally met a friendly American face, after nearly a year of fighting behind enemy lines, they didn't believe his story. They told him that Joseph R. Byerly had been killed in action on June 10th, 1944, and that they had already had a funeral mass in his honor in Muskegon, and that his obituary had already been printed in the paper. But despite Joseph painstakingly going through his story over and over again, the ambassador just could not believe what he was hearing. And so, worried Joseph might actually be a well-trained German spy, the ambassador sent him to Odessa to have his credentials verified. But Odessa had the same problem and couldn't verify him, so they sent him to Egypt. Egypt had the same problem, and they too could not verify his credentials. And so they sent him to Italy, where they finally used fingerprints, and they confirmed that yes, this is in fact Joseph R. Byerly. And so on April 11th, 1945, Joseph returned home, and needless to say, his parents were very surprised to see him because they were convinced he died 10 months earlier. 1 year later, Joseph would actually get married in the same church that held his funeral mass when everybody believed he was dead. Joseph was given the Purple Heart, and then in the 1990s was given additional presidential awards from US President Bill Clinton as well as the Russian President Boris Yeltsin. Joseph was also given a custom-made AK-47 from the guy who invented the AK-47. Joseph died in 2004 at the age of 81, and his son would go on to become the US ambassador to Russia under George W. Bush and Barack Obama. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please offer the like button a bag of Revels, but only leave the coffee-flavored kind. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel just called MrBallen's Shorts. It's where I post short videos. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. I didn't think there was anything more claustrophobia-inducing and terrifying than being trapped in an underwater cave. That is, until I discovered today's top story. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house and open up all of their cereal. But when you open the bags, make sure you tear them in such a way that you rip down the side of the bag, not along the intended seams at the top. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. Daniel Dukes always seemed to have an issue with respecting boundaries. In 1996, when Daniel was 24 years old, he became obsessed with this video game series called Ultima, which in the early days of PC gaming was this huge hit. It was this open world role-playing fantasy game. Daniel figured out where the creator of this game lived, and in the middle of the night in the spring of that year, he went to this guy's house and he knocked on the door. And when the creator did not answer the door, Daniel's frustrated and he leaves, but comes back a couple hours later and proceeds to break a window, climb inside this guy's house. He goes upstairs and he goes into one of the bedrooms where he crawls into one of the beds and falls asleep. The next morning, when the creator got up, he finds Daniel laying in one of his beds, and he starts yelling at him to get out of his house. And Daniel's totally unfazed and he just wants to sleep in this bed. And so the guy calls the police show up, and Daniel's still in bed. And so they haul him out and they arrest him. A year later, Daniel would be arrested again for trespassing, this time in Orlando, Florida at SeaWorld, where Daniel had, after hours, snuck into the manatee exhibit and was swimming around with the manatees because apparently he wanted to play with them. But despite his criminal history, Daniel was far from a hardened criminal. In fact, many people that knew him described him as a very gentle, pot-smoking hippie who just adored animals. In 1999, when Daniel was 27, he joined a small religious community of people that practiced Hare Krishna, which is a branch of Hinduism. They get their name from their chant, Hare Krishna, that devotees repeat over and over and over again. During his stay with this community, Daniel basically blew off all of his responsibilities. He didn't really practice the religion, he didn't help out around the temple. Instead, he spent virtually all of his time feeding the wild birds that came to roost inside of the temple's garden. And he kept this notebook where he diligently tracked who had come into the garden, which bird, and how much he had fed them, and what they looked like. Basically, all he cared about were these birds. After a month of living in the Hare Krishna community, Daniel abruptly tells the other worshippers that he's going to be taking a vow of silence. And this really confused the others because Hare Krishna does not encourage its members to take vows of silence. This was something Daniel was just going to do on his own. And so right before he took his vow of silence, he also informed them that he would be leaving. So he takes his vow of silence, he packs his stuff up, and he leaves. After departing, Daniel committed a series of petty offenses through South Carolina, Washington, Texas, and then ultimately in Florida. One of his offenses in Florida was stealing a candy bar at a 7-Eleven. And in court, because of his vow of silence that he was still living up to, he had to write on a piece of paper that he denied the charge. But ultimately, he was sent to jail for 3 days. After his stint in this Florida jail, Daniel gets out and he decides he wants to go back to Orlando, Florida, and go to the SeaWorld where he had previously jumped into the manatee exhibit. And so he was going to go and presumably check out the manatees as well as some other animals. When he got to the park, he made his way over to the killer whale demonstration where some trainers were going to be swimming around in this enclosure with these massive killer whales. And witnesses said they remember seeing Daniel in the stands watching the show, being just totally transfixed and open-mouthed and fascinated with what he was looking at. But apparently Daniel's biggest reaction to any part in the show was when the trainers brought out Tilikum, the biggest killer whale ever held in captivity, measuring over 22 feet long and weighing over 12,000 pounds. Daniel was just totally taken with Tilikum. So that night, after the park shut down and everyone went home, Daniel came back, now wearing a bathing suit. He hops the fence and he sneaks back into SeaWorld the same way he did a couple years earlier when he snuck into the manatee exhibit. And somehow he managed to go through the park without being picked up on a camera, and he makes his way over to the killer whale enclosure. He hops the fence, he takes off his shirt, takes off his shoes, so he's just got his bathing suit on, and he jumps into the massive pool with Tilikum. When Daniel jumped into the manatee exhibit, he had said he just wanted to play with manatees. And so it's assumed that when he jumped in with Tilikum, he just wanted to play with Tilikum. And apparently Tilikum was really eager to play with Daniel, because Tilikum quickly played with Daniel by biting his shorts and bringing him to the bottom of the pool and dragging him along the bottom until Daniel drowned. And then after he drowned, Tilikum basically thrashed him around, throwing him up and down, ripping off pieces of him, until finally he draped Daniel's body over his back, and that's where Tilikum kept him. The next day, when the staff showed up and made this discovery, they couldn't get Daniel's body away from Tilikum because Tilikum wanted to keep his toy. And so they had to use a special medical hoist to lift Tilikum up into the air to recover Daniel's body. Daniel's death was ruled an accident as a result of his poor decision making, and so as such, Tilikum was not punished. In 1910, miners drilling inside of the Nika Cave in Chihuahua, Mexico, punctured through the ground and discovered this flooded cavern. After pumping the water out and stepping inside of this cavern, they were amazed to see these massive gypsum crystals that had formed on the walls and the ceiling all over this cave. Although the crystals were beautiful, they were far less valuable than what these miners were after, which was silver. So instead of trying to, mine out these crystals, they told the locals in the area that they had found this cave and that they really ought to come down here and protect it because it's this amazing natural wonder. And so for the next 100 years, the locals in Chihuahua, Mexico, basically kept this cave that they nicknamed the Cave of Swords under lock and key so that no one would go in there and destroy these amazing crystals. Fast forward to the year 2000, and two men are inside of this mine, not the Nika mine where the Cave of Swords is located, but a mine that was right up against it. And they're drilling down, and they're actually at the same level of where the Cave of Swords is located. And they don't know it yet, but they're drilling underneath the Cave of Swords. And they eventually puncture into the rock, revealing this underground flooded cavern. Now, these two men are not tracking that this is right underneath the Cave of Swords. So they're not thinking there could be crystals inside of this flooded cavern. They're thinking there could be silver down there. So after pumping all the water out of this cavern, they crawl down inside and it opens up into this massive cavern with these enormous crystals coming out of the ceiling, the walls, everywhere. And they are like 10 times, 15 times bigger than any of the biggest crystals inside of the Cave of Swords. These are literally the biggest crystals in the world, And this cavern looks like Superman's Fortress of Solitude. It's this unbelievable landscape. This new cave would be dubbed the Giant Crystal Cave, and like its counterpart, the Cave of Swords, it would be handed over to locals to protect. Now you'd think people would be lining up like crazy to get inside either of these two caves to see these natural wonders. But the truth is, nobody wants to go inside of these caves because they're death traps. Even though both of these caves have had the water drained out of them, their humidity level is still 100%, which means if you're in there too long in either of these two caves, you run the risk of your lungs starting to fill with water, effectively drowning you. In fact, scientists speculate that it would take about 10 minutes for this to happen to you if you were inside one of these caves, assuming you were not wearing a special breathing device that was pumping dry air back into you. But even if you were wearing these special air tanks, the cave would still kill you in about an hour because the temperature exceeds 130 degrees Fahrenheit. And so if you combine the extreme heat with the humidity and the tight enclosed nature of an underground cave, you have a natural oven that if you stay in there too long, it will cook you alive. So the only people that go inside of these caves are researchers that wear all the special equipment, and they only go inside for a couple of minutes at most. But in 2001, so 1 year after the discovery of the Big Crystal Cave, one of the workers who helped drain out the Big Crystal Cave decided, you know what? I want a crystal for myself. And so using his understanding of the mine and his access to this particular section of the mine, he made his way down and got inside of the Big Crystal Cave. Now, the only special equipment he had was a saw, because he figured he could get in there and saw off a piece of one of these crystals and get out of there in just a couple of minutes, certainly well before anything bad would happen to him. So he gets inside, he identifies the crystal he wants, and he starts sawing off the bottom of this crystal. But it dislodges a huge chunk of the crystal that falls on him. Now, when it fell on him, that didn't kill him, but it pinned him inside of this cave. At this point, reality must have sunk in very quickly for this guy. He didn't tell anyone where he was going because what he was doing was illegal, and he knows that nobody checks inside of these caves to see if people are trapped or stuck, because they don't expect people to go into these caves, and they're off limits. A couple of days later, researchers went down into Big Crystal Cave, and they discovered this guy still pinned underneath the big crystal he had cut from the ceiling. It was unclear whether he had died from drowning or from being cooked alive, but either way, he was deceased. To this day, Big Crystal Cave and the Cave of Swords are strictly off limits to the public. On June 30th, 2002, an 18-year-old named Daniel Dick was on vacation with his mother and his two younger brothers in Hawaii. Daniel had just graduated from his high school in Los Angeles, where he was the student body president. He was known to invite all of his classmates over to his house all the time for dinners, and girls would call him all the time to try to get advice about their boyfriends. And Daniel also would befriend troubled teens in an attempt to kind of pick them up and get them back on the straight and narrow. When he and his family left for this vacation, he had been working part-time at a grocery store and was getting ready to attend California State University in the fall. That morning, Daniel went down to the beach where he planned on doing some swimming and maybe laying out in the sun for a little bit, and pretty quickly he met 3 girls. And after about 30 minutes of chatting with them, he asked them if they wanted to climb over the fence and check out the blowhole. A blowhole is a fairly narrow hole that is situated on rocks right near where water is crashing. And this hole is usually formed by molten lava that has passed through underneath. And what happens is this hole is connected to a tunnel that feeds down and out into the water. So when the waves come in, they go through this tunnel and they get rocketed up this little opening, causing a massive geyser of water. Now, if you don't go near the blowhole, it's not dangerous at all. It's just a very cool natural phenomenon. The beach that Daniel and these girls were on was situated right near an infamously dangerous blowhole called the Halona Blowhole. The reason it was so dangerous is because the water it connected to through that tunnel was some of the most violent in all of Hawaii. So when those waves came barreling through the tunnel, it would shoot 30 plus feet in the air. And so to make sure everybody understood you're only allowed to watch the blowhole from a distance, they actually put up a fence all the way around it and put up signs saying, "Do not go any closer." To give you a sense of how powerful the water was that was churning through this tunnel, if you were standing on the other side of the fence watching the blowhole from a safe distance, you could feel the ground shaking as the waves would rumble through the tunnel and then explode out of the blowhole. According to Daniel's family and friends, he was not a reckless person, he was just a very adventurous person. And so something like this blowhole really piqued his interest, and he just couldn't handle being on the outside of the fence. He really wanted to get right up there and get a look at it. In fact, he told these girls he wanted to feel the power of the water hit him in the chest. That was his plan. The girls told him this was a bad idea, but he was insistent and he began walking over to the rocks where you could climb up and jump this fence. The girls went with him, but they stopped short of the fence. As Daniel made his way over to the rocks, he passed by a couple that was laying on the beach. He waved to them, he climbed up the rocks, he climbed over the fence, and he made his way over to the blowhole. And he timed it to where a wave had just come in and shot a geyser up, and then as soon as the water went down and there was a break, he walked over the edge of this hole that was not very far across, and he kind of arched himself over it so his chest was hovering right over where the water was going to come up. And initially, a wave came through and the water shot up and it hit him in the chest and it kind of staggered him back for a minute. And at this point, the three girls and the couple that he had passed are now yelling for him to get away from the blowhole, that it's way too dangerous. But it was too late. He leaned back over the blowhole right as a massive wave came barreling through the tunnel. It rocketed up and it lifted him off the ground about 5 feet in the air, and it turned him upside down so his head is pointed down. And when he fell, he went directly into the blowhole. The couple and the three girls that saw this happen described his body position as being the perfect dive. And in order to actually get into the blowhole, you would need the perfect body position, because the opening is very narrow and it goes down 8 feet of just this narrow tube. And at the bottom of that, it opens up like the inside of a teapot. And inside of there is this just vicious churning water that connects to this underground tunnel that feeds out to the sea. And so when Daniel went head first down, his momentum, along with his perfect body position, forced himself down through that hole into that section that's kind of like the inside of a teapot. And once you're inside, there's no way to go back up again. The opening is too tight, there's nothing to hold on to. You wouldn't have the ability to force yourself up through that hole again. So the only way out is through the underground tunnel that leads out to the sea. But there are constantly waves pounding their way up this tunnel into the section where Daniel had fallen into. And so realistically, anybody that tries to swim through this fairly long underground tunnel is only going to get so far before a wave forces them back or traps them in some way in this underground tunnel. As soon as Daniel went into the blowhole, the couple and the three girls immediately climbed up the rocks, hopped over the fence, and began looking into the tunnel, yelling for Daniel. And as they're sitting there yelling for him and yelling for people on the beach to call 911, they would feel the ground start to shake as another wave would come through the tunnel and erupt through the blowhole. And they know every time that happened, Daniel, if he was alive, he was completely submerged in water for 30 seconds or so every iteration that this blowhole erupted. By the time the police showed up, Daniel has been trapped inside of this blowhole for some time, and no one's heard him, no one's seen him, and so it's starting to look pretty grim. And the police would say it's nearly impossible for anybody to survive being inside of this blowhole, especially at high tide, which is when he went in. In fact, the police would say, we can't even send divers in there until low tide, because if we send someone in now, they're gonna get killed inside of this blowhole. It's too violent inside of there. And so the best they could do was put a weighted line into the blowhole anchored on the outside, so that if by some miracle Daniel was still alive, he'd be able to grab this line and pull himself up. He probably would not be able to pull himself through the hole to safety, but at least he could keep himself out of the water until rescuers could get there the next day at low tide. But when low tide came the next day and divers went out to the water, they discovered Daniel's body. It was floating near the area where water actually gets sucked into the tunnel and out through the blowhole. During low tide, he must have been pulled back out through the tunnel out to sea. It's unclear how long Daniel was alive once he landed inside of the blowhole, or whether he ever attempted to actually swim through that tunnel out to sea, but at some point he did drown. Daniel's mother petitioned to have a metal grate put over the blowhole so that nobody else would fall in and meet the same fate as her son, but this proposal was met with criticism from the locals, who said the problem was not the blowhole, the problem was people not respecting the power of nature. And so while a fence still surrounds Helena Blowhole telling people to stay back, the entrance to the blowhole is still uncovered. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please sneak into the Like Button's house and open their cereal. But when you open the bag, make sure you tear down the side of the bag, not along the intended seams at the top. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok, where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See you. A more accurate title for this video could be The Worst Ways to Die. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please go over to the Like Button's house and ask to play hide and go seek. When they are hiding, switch their regular coffee for decaf coffee, and then don't seek them, just leave. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. Nicknamed the Great Gray Green Greasy, the Limpopo River is one of Africa's largest rivers. It serves as a border between Zimbabwe and South Africa, and it also happens to be one of the most dangerous places on Earth. A town in South Africa called Phalaborwa sits on Limpopo's shores, and all of its residents know they're never supposed to step foot inside of the dangerous waterway. But not all of their residents take that guidance seriously. On January 1st, 2010, Phalaborwa resident Mariska Buitendog, along with her boyfriend and 6 of their other friends, had been out all night partying, celebrating the new year. They had had a considerable amount of alcohol over the course of the night, so as the sun was coming up, in their inebriated state, they decided they wanted to take an early morning dip in the Limpopo River. So they head over to the river, and while initially they all seemed really eager to get in the waterway, it was only Mariska that was brave enough to do it. So the rest stayed on shore, and Mariska jumped in the river and jumped right out again. And she survived, and everyone was very impressed with her. And so she's confident, and so she does it again, this time going a little bit farther out into the river before coming back on shore. Now she's really confident, she's done it twice, and so she said, "Hey, who wants to come with me for a 3rd time in?" And the group said, "No, we're still good, and you really shouldn't push your luck. This is not safe." And she said, "I don't care, I'm going in for a 3rd time." So Mariska gets in the water, and by herself, she swims out on her back about 15 meters away from shore. She turns and waves at the group and smiles before she is violently pulled under the water. There wasn't even time for her to scream. Her boyfriend immediately jumped into the water to try to pull her out, but he knew where she was, and there was no way he was getting her back. The other nickname for the Limpopo River is Crocodile River, and Mariska, unfortunately, had fell victim to one of its apex predators. But it's not just drunk partygoers that fall victim to these crocodiles. Unfortunately for the residents of Zimbabwe, because of the extreme hardships they have to face, many of them have been forced to flee the country and cross over the Limpopo River to try to gain entry into South Africa. And many of them will die trying. On April 11th, 2014, Zimbabwean and South African police discovered this crocodile-infested cave right near where Zimbabwean residents will try to cross over the Limpopo River. And inside of this cave were the remains of 15 people that presumably tried to cross over and were caught by crocodiles. The discovery of this cave and the 15 people who lost their lives inside of it, while tragic and certainly gruesome, it only represents a fraction of the total number of people who have died trying to cross this river. Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming is one of the most remarkable and beautiful places on Earth. Not only is it renowned for its biodiversity, which includes some incredibly resilient microbial organisms, it's also home to one of the world's so-called supervolcanoes. This supervolcano sits atop one of the world's largest magma bodies fueled by an upwelling plume of superheated material. This dynamic and violent subterranean plumbing means the water bodies at the surface, the famous Yellowstone hot springs, are highly acidic and incredibly hot. If you were to ignore the countless warnings around these hot springs telling you to stay away, do not go in the hot springs, if you were to ignore those and go in one, or more accurately, fall in one, this is what would happen to you. First, your body would register that your skin was bathing in waters exceeding 200 degrees Fahrenheit. This would hurt like nothing you can possibly imagine. But it would only hurt as long as your nervous system was able to register pain, which would only be for about 1 minute or less. At this temperature, your skin would begin to quickly break down and disintegrate, and your blood vessels in your underlying dermis would rupture, causing rapid blood loss. Some underlying skin layers would not break down, but they would lose all of their water and become tough and blackened. And your underlying subcutaneous fat would bubble off as well. All in all, this is known as a full thickness burn, and it would occur in about 1 minute in these waters. Your nervous system would enter a state of shock and become irreversibly damaged, which would lead to most, if not all, of your organs to fail if the heat stress has not already done that to you. You would be dead within 2 to 3 minutes, and then at that point, the acidity of the water would take over. Within a few hours, your body, including your skeleton, would be completely dissolved into absolute nothingness. And for anyone who falls in but manages to climb out again before being dissolved, they are not out of the woods. Many of those people, unfortunately, will die hours, days, months later due to complications from the burns. On June 7, 2016, Colin Scott and his sister Sable went to Yellowstone to see the famous hot springs. The siblings were exploring the Norris Geyser Basin, which is the park's oldest and hottest thermal area, when they decided to leave the safety of the boardwalk and walk past all the signs telling them, do not leave the boardwalk, this is dangerous, turn around. They decided to walk past all of those and venture out off the course. They walked approximately 200 meters away from the path to the edge of a hot spring that was not really part of the main tour, and they were just standing there when Colin apparently tripped and fell into the hot spring. And his sister was just not able to do anything. She knew she couldn't go in after him, and he very quickly sunk below the surface and didn't come up again. She ran back to try to get help, but by the time they got back to the edge of the hot spring, he was gone. And in fact, the only thing they would find of Colin Scott was his flip-flops. Since 1890, Colin Scott, along with 21 other people, have died by falling into these hot springs. There is a remote cliff face in northern England that rarely gets tourists. If you were standing in front of it, you would see this little stream that went into a break in the limestone. It's this little tiny hole, and that stream is called the Mossdale Beck. If you crouched down and walked through that hole, you would be entering the Mossdale Caverns, which since 1967 have been permanently sealed off to cavers. Once inside the Mossdale Caverns entranceway, you could look down and see that little stream, the Mossdale Beck, would be going between your legs, and then right in front of you, it would split in 2 distinct directions down respective tunnels. To the right, the water flows down 7 miles of accessible passageway. However, most of it is incredibly tight and it's prone to flooding. As a result, fewer people have seen the far reaches of the right side of Mossdale Cavern than have stepped on the moon. To the left, the water goes through these impenetrable rocks that no one has gotten past. In fact, no one knows what's beyond these rocks. However, scientists have determined the water that goes left at the entranceway will re-emerge 18 days later, 5 miles away, 900 feet lower, in a pool called the Black Keld. The massive tunnel system that we know exists but has yet to be explored that connects the entranceway to Black Keld is referred to as the missing link. You would think cavers from all over the world would be clamoring to get inside that accessible side, the right side of Mossdale Caverns, and try to find a secret access point back to the missing link, to be the first person to discover that, to stake your claim and say, that was me. But in fact, since the Mossdale Caverns was discovered in 1941 until 1967, almost no one went in Mossdale Caverns. Endless, tight, water-filled crawls with names like Drown or Glory made Mossdale Caverns feel like too big of a risk to be worth it. But in 1967, 10 extremely fit, extremely experienced cavers said, you know what? We are going in Mossdale Cavern and we are going to find that entrance to the missing link. So on June 24th, 1967, these 10 cavers entered Mossdale Caverns. They went right into the accessible 7 miles of passageway and they began their descent. And it wasn't that long until 2 of the 10 cavers, the 2 least experienced of the group, said, you know what? I don't want to do this anymore. Got a bad feeling about this, but we don't know the way out. And so they needed chaperones to leave. And so 2 other cavers from the group had to go with them. So 4 cavers, they leave Mossdale Caverns. The other 6 are going to continue on. So when the 4 got back to the surface, it was about 5 p.m. They had been in the cavern for several hours at this point. And when they went in, initially, the weather was great. It was beautiful. It was clear. Now they're coming out again, and it had started to rain. Not significantly. It was more like a drizzle, but they were a little bit concerned because they knew the other 6 were planning to be in the cavern until after midnight. So they were just hopeful that the rain did not get any worse. But just a couple of hours later, the skies opened up and it rained like it hadn't rained in years. Just torrential downpour, and the 4 were really concerned about the other 6. So they went back to the entrance hoping that maybe, the other 6 would have heard the rain, although it's very unlikely considering how deep they were going to be. But they were hoping that maybe they'd be coming out again and they would see them and get them back to safety. But when they arrived there, not only were the 6 not out of the cave, but the actual entrance to the cave was completely submerged in water. Earlier that day, when the 4 cavers turned around and left, the other 6 cavers, they continued on, and they had made it about 2 miles deep into these caves. They had passed the fabled drown or glory swim, they had survived the knee-wrecker passage, and they had bit their tongue as they squeezed through the famously painful Umaguli tunnel, now located hours away from the only way out. So they are way into this cave. They were nearing the end of this distant section of the cave that they believed on the other end they would find this hidden entrance into the missing link. All they had to do was pass through the far marathon section, which is a 900-foot tunnel that is only 10 inches high, 2 feet wide, and you have to wriggle through on your stomach with your face pressed against a stream that runs through it. And it takes a very long time to get through it. It's incredibly claustrophobia inducing. It's considered one of the most stressful things you can do in caving. But considering how experienced these cavers were and the fact that they had come down there specifically to get to this far point in the cave, you got to figure that their spirits were high. They were probably joking with each other as they're doing this awful thing. And then they made it about 3/4 of the way through this tunnel when someone must have noticed the distant rumbling sound and said, "Hey, what is that?" And as they sat there listening, trying to discern what the sound was, it must have dawned on them that their worst nightmare was about to come true. That was the sound of surging water. This tunnel is about to flood. They began crawling faster and faster down the marathon tunnel. Not only was it very difficult to move quickly inside of this very tight tunnel, but they also knew there was nowhere to go. They're 2 miles underground. They must have felt like the world of sunshine and fresh air was suddenly an eternity away. The oldest of the group was 26. The rest of them were all in their teens. United now by fear, the water came rushing in as they're all pinned inside of the far marathon tunnel, and their face is already up against the river, and now this river is surging with water. And so they're all desperately trying to crawl through this flooding tunnel, and the leader of the group, the guy literally in the front, John Ogden, who was 26, he managed to get all the way through the far marathon tunnel to the space where they anticipated finding that secret entrance into the missing link. That wasn't there, but he found above him there was a small fissure in the rocks. There was an air pocket, and he managed to get his head up into the space right as the water in the far marathon cave completely submerged. So any of the cavers in there, they drowned inside of the far marathon. The bubble that he was in was a little bit bigger, and so some of the cavers managed to get in there, and they tried to clamber into this air pocket as well, but ultimately there was only enough room for one person, and John was the only one up there. And so as the water levels filled the room he was in up to his neck, everyone below John drowned. Now, we don't know if John literally kept other people from getting into this air pocket with him. All we know is it could only hold one person, and ultimately John was the one who was left inside of this crevice. But this air pocket was really just delaying the inevitable because there wasn't very much air inside of it, and John's 2 miles below the surface. There is no way anyone is going to get to him in time. And so he ended up dying a couple days later, and when they found him, he was still in the air pocket trying to get one last breath. What I've not covered in this story that I would encourage you all to check out is there was this incredible effort to try to save these cavers before anyone knew they were deceased. There was this hope that maybe they found an air pocket and they were still alive. And so they basically created this artificial dam that was very precarious. The water could at any moment spill over, and it provided just enough drainage inside of this cavern for some of the best cavers in the world to go into the cavern to look for them. And so they went into this cavern knowing at any minute that makeshift dam on the surface could break and they will 100% drown in here. No one's coming to get them. They had to crawl through the Far Marathon Tunnel all the way down at the bottom to get to the lost cavers, and ultimately when they discovered they were all deceased, it would have been impossible to remove their bodies. And so the decision was made to leave the 6 cavers where they died and seal off the cave permanently. So in 1967, they sealed it off, and they now treat Mossdale Caverns like a gravesite, and no one goes in it. So that's gonna do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please go over to the like button's house and ask to play hide and seek. When the like button is hiding, switch their regular coffee with decaf coffee, and then do not seek the like button, just leave. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. So fair warning, I've included a video with today's number 2 story, and if you have a fear of deep, dark water or are claustrophobic, you may want to consider skipping it. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please tell the like button you're sorry for all the hostility this year, and that you want to take them on vacation as a way of making up for it. When they say yes, bring them to Skinwalker Ranch and promptly punt them through the portal. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In October of 2007, Helena Carroll and her fiancé, John Cullen, had saved a little bit of money, and they were torn on what to do with it. They knew they should put it aside and put it towards a down payment on a new house, but they also really wanted to go on vacation, and lately life had been very stressful for both of them, and so ultimately they decided, let's just blow it all on an amazing vacation. And so later that month, they flew off to Thailand. Over the course of their week, they spent most of their time at their resort, sitting in the pool and eating nice food, and they were having this really nice time. And on their last day, they decided they needed to do something a little bit more adventurous. And so they decided to explore the Nam Talu cave inside of the Khao Sok National Park, which is this 160 million year old rainforest that was not that close to their resort. In fact, it was not really a huge tourist destination because of how cumbersome it was to get there. But from everything they read about this park, and specifically this cave they wanted to go in, it was just this breathtaking experience, and so they were sold. After signing up for a guided tour, they headed down to the pier where they boarded a boat and drove 90 minutes to the entrance of this park. When they got off, they met their 2 guides and then walked down to this entrance area where they connected with the other 5 tourists that were going to be on this tour with them. Those 5 people were 2 Swiss parents and their 2 teenage daughters, along with a 10-year-old German boy who was there on his own. After everyone had said hello and introduced themselves, they began walking through the park towards this cave. The allure of the Nam Talu cave, which is the cave they were going to be going to, was there was a river that ran through it, where at times as you walked through this cave, you'd have to hold onto a rope and wade through the water, where the water was up to your waist or even up to your neck at times. But it felt safe and controlled, and it was kind of exhilarating for foreign tourists to go through the cave. As they were just about to get to the entrance of the Nam Talu cave, some park rangers happened to walk down the path next to them, and they exchanged some words with the 2 local guides that were leading this tour, and they told them it's a bad idea to go into the Nam Talu cave because this is the monsoon season. No one's supposed to be in there, and if it starts raining while you're inside the cave, you won't hear it, and it will flood the cave, and then you'll be trapped. But despite the warning, the group continued on because it hadn't rained that day and there wasn't any rain in the forecast, and the 2 local guides that were leading this tour were really confident that they were not in danger. They entered the cave a little after 1 p.m. and right away they were walking through little puddles of water that got a little bit deeper, and pretty soon they were holding onto the rope and walking through the deeper sections of the cave. Water's up to their waist, and by all accounts it was very exciting. And the entirety of the tour should only take about an hour, where it's 30 minutes in, you hit the turnaround point and you come back. And they had made it about 20 to 25 minutes in, right before the turnaround point, when Helena and John, who were towards the front of the tour group, heard what sounded like a rushing or roaring sound coming from the entrance of the cave. And they turned around and they saw this wave of water barreling into the cave. And instinctively, John and Helena start climbing up the walls, and luckily there was a ledge where they were, and they managed to scramble up onto this ledge. And Helena would say as soon as she got up there, she turned around to look where she had just been standing, right as this surge of water blasted past them, carrying with it the 2 tour guides and the 10-year-old German boy, who immediately got swept around the corner down the dark tunnel. And then seconds later, the 2 Swiss parents and their teenage daughters, they got swept away around the corner. The couple was now stranded on this ledge with no time to be upset about what they're witnessing, because the water was not only surging past them, it was rising, and there was limited amount of space before they would just be completely submerged in water. And so they tried their best to climb up this wall to a slightly higher ledge, which was still only a few feet away from these rushing rapids. And so as they're crouched up on this ledge, John eventually says to Helena, we're gonna die if we stay here, we're gonna drown. And so I need to find a way to maybe get past this initial rush of water, and maybe on the far side of the cave, I can work my way back up to the entrance and hopefully get us some help. And initially Helena said, don't do it, don't leave, we're safe here. But eventually he said to her, I have to go. I love you, I have to go. And she said, okay. And he jumped into the water, and almost immediately he was pulled under and disappeared. For the next 20 hours, Helena had to sit on this ledge in total darkness until the water finally began to subside a little bit and rescuers could come in to get her. What had happened was, after Helena and the rest of the tour group had gone inside of the cave, they made it just far enough in that they were out of earshot of what was happening outside of the cave. Right at that moment, a huge freak storm rolled in. There was this flash flood that was so intense, the lake that was right outside of the entrance to this cave, it rose up and began dumping directly into the cave. It was like a dam basically breaking, and all the water just poured in all at once. When Helena was finally let out of the cave, she didn't know what happened to her fiance or the other tourists that were part of the group. But as soon as she stepped outside, she saw there were 8 coffins that had been lined up right outside, and she found out that she was the sole survivor. Despite this tragedy, people still go into the Nam Talu cave even during monsoon season. In 2014, 35-year-old Darren Spivey was a passionate scuba diver, and he wanted to share that passion with his 15-year-old son, Dylan. So on Christmas Eve that year, he gave his son an early gift, scuba tanks. The pair was apparently so excited to use them that they planned on doing an early morning dive the very next day on Christmas. Later, Dylan's grandmother would tell the media that her grandson actually didn't really want to go on this dive trip, but he knew his dad did, and he adored his father and didn't want to let him down, so he decided to go anyways. The following morning, the father and son got up and they made their way to a local dive site, only to discover that the gate to the dive site was locked. The father still really wanted to do this dive, and so he decided he would take them to another dive site in Central Florida, which was inside of a wildlife management area that he knew was open 24/7 to hunters and hikers and divers. So the pair drove over to the entrance of this park, and sure enough, it was open. And so they went through and began driving down these windy back roads until they finally reached this dirt lot that was right next to a pond. They got out of the car, they put on their wetsuits and their scuba gear, and began waddling their way over to this wooden walkway that starts in the parking lot and goes all the way up and out onto the pond like a dock. And as they walked down this wooden walkway, they would have passed a number of signs telling them, do not dive in this pond unless you're an expert diver. Because this is not just some pond. This pond was the entrance to the infamous and deadly Eagle's Nest, which in the cave diving community is known as the Mount Everest of cave diving. At the bottom of this little placid-seeming pond is a narrow hole that is a tunnel that goes straight down, and that is the single way in or out of this massive underwater cave system. Expert divers will swim over to this hole and grab the guideline that goes down into this cave, and they'll follow it and they'll swim straight down until the light above them fades, and all they can see below them is just black nothingness. And once they get through the end of this tunnel, it opens up into this massive chasm that's called the ballroom. And as soon as you get into the ballroom, if you stop and shine your light in any direction, you will not see a wall. No matter how powerful your flashlight is, you can't see a wall, it's so big. Divers that have been down there have said it feels like you're in outer space. This guideline goes straight down to the bottom of the ballroom at about 130 feet, at which point you see a sign that has a Grim Reaper on it that says, "Stop, prevent your own death, do not go any farther. There's nothing in this cave that is worth dying for." Basically, this is your last chance to turn around and get to the surface relatively easily, because from this sign, the cave splits off in two different directions, where the tunnel gets narrower and it kind of spiders around, and in certain points it goes all the way down to 300 feet. So beyond this sign, it is extremely dangerous unless you know what you're doing, and even then, it's still extremely dangerous. There's also a current that runs through Eagle's Nest, so if you were to lose the guideline, especially in the ballroom, you could be blown away and then have a really hard time finding it again because it's pitch black down there, and it's like finding a needle in a haystack. And if you're not holding on to the guideline, it's nearly impossible to find the one way out. So you understand how intimidating and dark and dangerous this place is, here's a video of a diver going through that tunnel into the ballroom.
Down there's a warning sign or a stop sign, warning divers that aren't trained for this type of diving, cave trained or trimix trained, to not go any further, to help save lives. A lot of divers have died trying to do these types of dives, and the thing is, at these depths, small mistakes can cost lives. So the sign is there just as a warning to help prevent any future accident.
But as Darren and Dylan sat at the end of the walkway getting ready to jump into this pond, they were unfazed by the countless warnings, even though neither of them were expert divers. In fact, Dylan wasn't even a certified diver at all. This was one of his first dives. Before the pair jumped into the water, Darren texted his fiancée and said they were at Eagle's Nest and they were about to do this dive and that he would call when they got back to the surface. After that, he put his phone away on the surface and the two of them jumped into the water and started swimming their way over to the entrance to Eagle's Nest. Hours went by and Darren's fiancée did not get a call from Darren. And so by the time the sun was going down, she decided she had to go check on them. So she hopped in the car and she drove to the parking lot at Eagle's Nest and she saw Darren's car and no sign of the boys anywhere. Police were called and very quickly professional divers were brought to Eagle's Nest to go down and see if they were still down there. The divers got in the water, they made their way over to the narrow entrance, they went down the tunnel, they entered into the ballroom, and they stopped, holding onto the guideline. They pulled out their flashlights and began scanning around the ceiling immediately inside of the ballroom, because they had done this before, and it was not uncommon to have fatalities inside of caves be near the entrance. And as they're scanning around, they stop when they see Dylan's lifeless body trapped up against the ceiling about 6 feet away from the entrance. He had inflated his water wings, which are emergency flotation devices. His mouthpiece was out of his mouth, and it would turn out he had no more air left in his tanks. After the divers retrieved Dylan's body, they went back into Eagle's Nest, and they went all the way down following the guideline to the bottom of the ballroom, where they found Darren. He was laying on a little sandy hill, his mouthpiece was out, he also had no air left in his tanks, and he was laying right next to the famous sign that has the Grim Reaper on it that says, "Stop, prevent your own death, don't go any farther." Both Darren and Dylan's gauges showed they had gone down to 230 feet. For reference, between 0 and 130 feet is considered recreational diving. And so in those depths, you can breathe regular air, so the same air you breathe on the surface is the air that goes in your tanks. You don't need really special training. You can kind of do whatever you want in those depths. Below 130 feet, you need to breathe a special gas mix, you need special equipment, and you definitely need specialized training. All three of those things Dylan and Darren did not have. After an investigation was done into their deaths, it was determined it was an accident, and the going theory was they went through the entrance into the ballroom, they went all the way down, and then they went into one of the two tunnels that spiders off to the side, and they managed to go all the way down to 230 feet. And at that depth, they must have developed a nasty case of nitrogen narcosis, which is like being drunk. And so in that state, they must have lost track of time and how much air they were using. And so by the time they got back to the ballroom to begin their ascent, they ran out of air. The son must have run out first and grabbed his father, shown him his air gauge to point out that he has no air left. His dad, in seeing that, must have taken his regulator out and put it in his son's mouth, and they began buddy breathing as they ascended to the exit. Except the father's tanks also ran out of air very shortly after that, and the father passed out and sank to the bottom. The son managed to get a full breath of air and began trying to swim as fast as he could to the surface. He even inflated his water wings to make himself go faster. Except in his panic, he must have let go of the guideline and swam all the way up and then hit the ceiling and then been not able to find the way out and ultimately drowned. Today, despite all the warnings outside and inside of the cave itself telling inexperienced divers to not go any farther, inexperienced divers continue to go into Eagle's Nest, and inexperienced divers continue to die inside of Eagle's Nest. To date, 11 people have died inside of that cave. Midday on June 10th, 1981, an Italian man and his 6-year-old son walked to the edge of their property in Frascati, which is an area in Italy known as the hub of Rome's local wine industry. The father needed to repair a section of their fence, and his son, who he said had the soul of Huckleberry Finn, wanted to tag along. But as soon as the work began, Alfredo just wanted to go play in the vineyards, and so he ran off. And the father didn't think much of it because his son always played in the vineyards and just figured he would see him back at the house. When the father finished up the work around 7 p.m. and walked back into his house, he was surprised that Alfredo wasn't there. And so he asked his wife, have you seen our son? And she said, no, can you go out and find him because dinner's going to be on the table any minute. So the father goes back outside expecting to see Alfredo come running out from behind some hiding place, but he doesn't. And he yells out for his son and doesn't get a response. And so he begins walking his property and yelling for Alfredo, and he's not finding him. And so after 2 hours of looking, he finally just calls the police. The police arrive, and initially it's just a couple of officers with flashlights, and they spend about 2 hours looking as well. They can't find him, so they call in backup in the form of officers with sniffer dogs, and the dogs began searching the property for another 3 hours, and they still couldn't find him. A little after midnight, the fire department, known in Italy as the fire brigade, they joined in as well. Shortly thereafter, a fire brigade officer was on the edge of Alfredo's property when he discovered a small hole in the ground. It would turn out Alfredo's neighbor had dug an illegal well, which was a common practice at the time, and generally, if you dug one of these wells and you struck water, you would report the well. But if you dug down and you didn't find water, you would just cover it up with a girder and you wouldn't tell anyone. In this case, however, the hole the officer was looking at did not have anything covering it. And so he knelt down and he yelled Alfredo's name into this hole, and at first he didn't hear anything. Then he yelled again, and he heard Alfredo yell back for his mother. Alfredo must not have seen the opening as he was running around playing, and he fell feet first into an 80-meter deep shaft. After Alfredo was found, the fire brigade took over rescue efforts, and so additional fire brigade units were called to help. But as soon as those additional units showed up, the captains of the different units began arguing with each other because it wasn't really clear how they were going to get him out. And unfortunately, the fire brigade immediately made a very bad decision. They decided to lower a plank into the shaft attached by a rope that he could grab onto, and they could pull him out that way. But when they lowered it at about 24 meters, the plank got stuck inside of the tunnel, and when they yanked on the rope to try to free it, the rope came off of the plank, but the plank remained wedged in the tunnel, blocking the tunnel. By the following morning, TV crews had swarmed the area, and one of them offered up a two-way microphone that could be lowered down into the hole so they could talk directly to Alfredo. When the microphone was finally lowered down next to his face, he was crying and pleading for them to get him out and that he missed his mother. Amateur spelunker Tullio Barnaby, a 23-year-old, had come over and joined the vigil that night. The plank plan shocked him for its foolishness, and so too did the scene. It was like everyone and no one was in charge. The well opening had been widened in hopes that a very skinny person would be willing to be lowered down to remove the piece of wood that was obstructing the tunnel. And since Tullio was a spelunker and was comfortable in confined spaces and was pretty skinny, he volunteered himself to do it. As he was lowered down, he quickly realized the inside of this tunnel was not a straight shot. It was more like a corkscrew. And so because of its windy nature, he was not able to get down to the wood. And so he signaled to go back up again. And when he reached the surface, he didn't have the wood in hand, but he told the fire brigade that because of the windy nature, it's unlikely Alfredo fell all the way to the bottom. He's probably stuck somewhere in the middle, which is a good thing. But we have to be really careful as we pull him out that we don't do anything that unintentionally causes him to slip farther into the hole. Tullio's suggestion was they go out and recruit professional spelunkers to be involved in the rescue because they would understand how to get someone out of such a tight space so far down in the ground. But the fire brigade disregarded his advice and said we don't have enough time for that. At 6 a.m. the next day, about 12 hours after Alfredo's fallen into the swell, the fire brigade would make another very poor decision. They decided they would drill down another hole parallel to the one Alfredo was in, and they would drill down past the point they believed Alfredo was, at which point they would turn and drill laterally and connect to the tunnel Alfredo's in, grabbing Alfredo, pulling him across, and back up the new tunnel. Tullio objected, and he said the vibrations from this drill are almost certainly going to dislodge the boy and cause him to slip farther into the tunnel. But once again, the fire brigade did not listen to him. The drilling began about 2 hours later, and by that afternoon, Alfredo's plight had become major national news, with every single TV station playing a 24/7 live broadcast of the well, watching the drilling take place. Even the Italian president made a special trip to the well to see how it was going. But the drilling was very slow, and Alfredo, he had that microphone next to his head, and he was crying half the time. Then the other times, he was just pleading with them to get him out and saying he was cold or that he was tired, and the rescuers would say, "We're going to be down there to get you. Don't fall asleep. We're going to get you out of there." Finally, after 36 hours, they had drilled all the way down to their intended stopping point, and they began drilling across into Alfredo's well. When they finally broke into Alfredo's well, rescuers rushed in with flashlights and looked up and looked down, and there was no sign of Alfredo. And they called it up to the top, and they said, "He's not here." And then all of a sudden, they heard a faint voice coming from all the way down at the bottom of the well. The vibrations from all of the drilling had indeed caused Alfredo to slip all the way to the very bottom. They estimated he was approximately 30 meters below this new parallel tunnel, and at that depth, the temperatures would be freezing. And so now Alfredo, on top of everything else, was facing hypothermia. They quickly lowered the microphone again down to Alfredo, and they told him, "We're going to get you out of there. We're sorry we dropped you, but we're going to get you." And Alfredo's voice came back weak. He was tired, he was sore, he was freezing, he was crying. It was like the situation was just getting so much worse by the second, and rescuers knew they had to get to him probably in the next couple of hours, or that was it. And so another skinny man volunteered to go down into the hole, and they lowered him, and he would go all the way down to the bottom where Alfredo was, and he would call up that he found him and that Alfredo was alive. But Alfredo was stuck waist deep in this mud that the guy could not pull him out of. And so every time he'd begin to raise him slightly out of the mud, he'd lose his grip and he would fall back into the mud, going deeper into the mud each time. And after the 7th time of not being able to do it, Alfredo was getting dangerously close to being neck deep in the mud. And so the guy had to be pulled back out again. As soon as he was pulled back out again, more men volunteered themselves to go in there and try to yank him out, but many of them were not able to even get down to Alfredo. They would get stuck along the way. A couple did get to Alfredo, but they said his condition was worsening, he was weak, he wasn't even assisting trying to get pulled out. It was clear they were reaching the end. Finally, at 6:36 a.m. on Saturday, so 2.5 days after Alfredo fell in, they could not get him to respond on that two-way microphone. And so they sent down a sonar probe, and they could not detect a heartbeat, and doctors declared him dead. The next day, liquid nitrogen was poured into the hole to preserve the body, and then 31 days later, they were finally able to extract it. After it was all over, the 25 million plus people that watched this take place live on television were crushed with what happened to Alfredo. There was a general sense that lots of people let this poor child down, which led to his death. But the person who was ultimately held accountable for it was the neighbor who had illegally dug the well. And so the neighbor was charged with manslaughter and was sent to jail, but their sentence is not publicly available online. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please tell the like button you are sorry for all the hostility this year and that you want to take them on vacation as a way of making up for it. When they agree, take them to Skinwalker Ranch and promptly punt them through the portal. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Twitter or on Instagram. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See you.